Section 6 of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 9, European Statesmen, by John Lord. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Napoleon Bonaparte, Part 1. A.D. 1769 to 1821. The French Empire. It is difficult to say anything new about Napoleon Bonaparte, either in reference to his genius, his character, or his deeds. His genius is universally admitted, both as a general and an administrator. No general so great has appeared in our modern times. He ranks with Alexander and Caesar in ancient times, and he is superior to Gustavus Adolphus, Turenne, Condé, Marlborough, Frederick II., Wellington, or any of the warriors who have figured in the great wars of Europe, from Charlemagne to the battle of Waterloo. His military career was so brilliant that it dazzled contemporaries. Without the advantages of birth or early patronage, he rose to the highest pinnacle of human glory. His victories were prodigious and unexampled, and it took all Europe to resist him. He aimed at nothing less than universal sovereignty, and had he not, when intoxicated with his conquests, attempted impossibilities, his power would have been practically unlimited in France. He had all the qualities for success in war: insight, fertility of resource, rapidity of movement, power of combination, coolness, intrepidity, audacity, boldness tempered by calculation, will, energy which was never relaxed, powers of endurance, and all the qualities which call out enthusiasm and attach soldiers and followers to personal interests. His victorious career was unchecked until all the nations of Europe, in fear and wrath, combined against him. He was a military prodigy, equally great in tactics and strategy, a master of all the improvements which had been made in the art of war, from Epaminondas to Frederick II. His genius for civil administration was equally remarkable, and is universally admitted. Even Metternich, who detested him, admits that he was as great a statesman as he was a warrior, and as great an administrator as he was a statesman. He brought order out of confusion, developed the industry of his country, restored the finances, appropriated and awarded all eminent talents, made the whole machinery of government subservient to his aims, and even seemed to animate it by his individual will. He ruled France as by the power of destiny. The genius of Richelieu, of Mazarin, and of Colbert pale before his enlightened mind, which comprehended equally the principles of political science and the vast details of a complicated government. For executive ability I know no monarch who has surpassed him. We do not associate with military genius, as a general rule, marked intellectual qualities in other spheres. But Napoleon was an exception to this rule. He was tolerably well educated, and he possessed considerable critical powers in art, literature, and science. He penetrated through all shams and impostures. He was rarely deceived as to men or women. He could be eloquent and interesting in conversation. Some of his expressions pierced like lightning, and were exceedingly effective. His despatches were laconic and clear. He knew something about everybody of note, and if he had always been in a private station, his intellectual force would have attracted attention in almost any vocation he might have selected. His natural vivacity, wit, and intensity would have secured friends and admirers in any sphere. Nor are the judgments of mankind less unanimous in reference to his character than his intellect and genius. He stands out in history in a marked manner, with two sides, great and little, good and bad. None can deny him many good qualities. His industry was marvellous. He was temperate in eating and drinking. He wasted no precious time. He rewarded his friends, to whom he was true. He did not persecute his enemies unless they stood in his way, and unless he had a strong personal dislike for them, as he had for Madame de Staël. He could be magnanimous at times. He was indulgent to his family, and allowed his wife to buy as many India shawls and diamonds as she pleased. He was never parsimonious in his gifts, although personally inclined to economy. He generally ruled by the laws he had accepted or enacted. He despised formalities and etiquette. He sought knowledge from every quarter. He encouraged merit in all departments. He was not ruled by women, like most of the kings of France. He was not enslaved by prejudices, and was lenient when he could afford to be. And in the earlier part of his career he was doubtless patriotic in his devotion to the interests of his country. Moreover, many of his faults were the result of circumstances, and of the unprecedented prosperity which he enjoyed. Pride, egotism, tyranny, and ostentation were to be expected of a man whose will was law. Nearly all men would have exhibited these traits had they been seated on such a throne as his, and almost any man's temper would have occasionally given way under such burdens as he assumed, such hostilities as he encountered, and such treasons as he detected. Surrounded by spies and secret enemies, he was obliged to be reserved. With a world at his feet, it was natural that he should be arbitrary and impatient of contradiction. There have been successful railway magnates as imperious as he, and bank presidents as supercilious, and clerical dignities as haughty, in their smaller spheres. Pride, consciousness, and egotism are the natural result of power and flattery in all conditions of life; and when a single man controls the destinies of nations, he is an exception to the infirmities of human nature if he does not seek to bend everything before his haughty will. There have been many Richelieus; there has been but one Marcus Aurelius. Many Hildebrands; only one Alfred. Many Ahabs; only one David. One St. Louis; one Washington. But with all due allowance for the force of circumstances in the development of character, and for those imperial surroundings which blind the arbiters of nations, there were yet natural traits of character in Napoleon which call out the severest reprobation, and which make him an object of indignation and intense dislike among true minded students of history. His egotism was almost superhuman; his selfishness was most unscrupulous; his ambition absolutely boundless. He claimed a monopoly in perfidy and lying; he had no idea of moral responsibility; he had no sympathy with misfortune, no conscience, no fear of God. He was cold, hard, ironical, and scornful. He was insolent in his treatment of women, brusque in manners, severe on all who thwarted or opposed him. He committed great crimes in his ascent to supreme dominion, and mocked the reason, the conscience, and the rights of mankind. He broke the most solemn treaties; he was faithless to his cause. He centred in himself the interests he was entrusted to guard. He recklessly insulted all the governments of Europe. He put himself above Providence. He disgracefully elevated his brothers. He sought to aggrandize himself at any cost, and ruthlessly grasped the sceptre of universal dominion as if he were an irresistible destiny whom it was folly to oppose. In all this he aimed to be greater than conscience. Such was the character of a despot who arose upon the ruins of the old monarchy, the product of a revolution whose ideas he proposed to defend. Most historians and all moralists are on the whole unanimous in this verdict. As for his deeds, they rise up before our minds, compelling admiration and awe. He was the incarnation of force; he performed the most brilliant exploits of our modern times. The question then arises, whether his marvellous gifts and transcendent opportunities were directed to the good of his country and the cause of civilization. In other words, did he render great services to France, which make us forget his faults? How will he be judged by enlightened posterity? May he be ranked among great benefactors, like Constantine, Charlemagne, Theodosius, Peter the Great, and Oliver Cromwell? It is the privilege of great sovereigns to be judged for their services rather than by their defects. Let us summon, then, this great emperor before the bar of universal reason. Let him make his own defence. Let us first hear what he has to say for himself, for he is the most distinguished culprit of modern times, and it may yet take 3 generations to place him in his true historical niche. And more, his fame, though immortal, may forever be in doubt, like that of Julius Caesar, whom we still discuss. This great man may quietly yet haughtily say to us who seek to take his measure, "It is for my services to France that I claim to be judged. I do not claim perfection. I admit I made grand mistakes. I even committed acts which the world stigmatizes as crimes. I seized powers which did not belong to me. I overthrew constitutions. I made myself supreme. I mocked the old powers of earth. I repudiated the ideas in the name of which I climbed to a throne. I was harsh, insolent, and tyrannical. I divorced the wife who was the maker of my fortune. I caused the assassination of the Duc d'Enghien. I invaded Spain and Russia, and I wafted the names of my conquering generals to the ends of the earth in imprecations and curses. These were my mistakes, crimes if you please to call them, but it is not for these you must judge me. Did I not come to the rescue of law and order when France was torn with anarchies? Did I not deliver the constituted authorities from the mob? Did I not rescue France from foreign enemies when they sought to repress the Revolution and restore the Bourbons? Was I not the avenger of 25 hungry millions on those old tyrants who would have destroyed their nationality? Did I not break up those combinations which would have perpetuated the enslavement of Europe? Did I not seek to plant liberty in Italy and destroy the despotisms of German princes? Did I not give unity to great states and enlarge their civilization? Did I not rebuke and punish Austria, Prussia, Russia, and England for interfering with our revolution and combining against the rights of a republic? Did I not elevate France, and give scope to its enterprise, and develop its resources, and inspire its citizens with an unknown enthusiasm, and make the country glorious, so that even my enemies came to my court to wonder and applaud? And did I not leave such an immortal prestige, even when I was disarmed and overthrown by the armies of combined Christendom, that my illustrious name, indelibly engraved in the hearts of my countrymen, was enough to seat my nephew on the throne from which I was torn, and give to his reign a glory scarcely inferior to my own? These were my services to France, the return of centralized power amid anarchies and discontents, and laws which successive revolutions have not destroyed, but which shall blaze in wisdom through successive generations. Now, how far can these claims be substantiated? Was Napoleon, although a usurper, like Cromwell and Caesar, also a benefactor like them? And did his fabric of imperialism prove a blessing to civilization? What, in reality, were his services? Do they offset his aspirations and crimes? Is he worthy of the praises of mankind? Great deeds he performed, but did they ultimately tend to the welfare of France and Europe? It was a great service which Napoleon rendered to France in the beginning of his career, at the siege of Toulon, when he was lieutenant of artillery. He disobeyed, indeed, the orders of his superior, but won success by the skill with which he planted his cannon, showing remarkable genius. This service to the Republic was not forgotten, although he remained long unemployed, living obscurely at Paris with straitened resources. By some means he caught the ear of Barras, the most able of the Directory, and was entrusted with the defence of the Convention in a great crisis, and saved by his "whiff of grape shot," as Carlyle calls his dispersion of the mob in the streets of Paris from the steps of St. Roch. This doubtless was a service to the cause of law and order, since he acted under orders, and discharged his duty like an obedient servant of the constituted authorities, without reluctance, and with great skill. Perhaps the only man of France at that time who could have done that important work so well, and with so little bloodshed. Had the sections prevailed, and it was feared that they would, the anarchy of the worst days of the Revolution would have resulted. But this decisive action of the young officer, entrusted with a great command, put an end for 40 years to the assumption of unlawful weapons by the mob. There was no future insurrection of the people against government till Louis Philippe was placed upon the throne in 1830. Napoleon here vindicated not only the cause of law and order, but the Revolution itself; for in spite of its excesses and crimes, it had abolished feudalism, unequal privileges, the reign of priests and nobles, and a worn out monarchy. It had proclaimed a constitutional government in the face of all the European despotisms. It had asserted that self government was a possibility even in France. It had inspired the whole nation with enthusiasm, and proclaimed the Republic when hostile armies were ready to march upon the soil of France and restore the Bourbons. All the impulses of the Revolution were generous; all its struggles were heroic, although it was sullied with crimes, and was marked by inexperience and follies. The nation rallied around a great idea, an idea which is imperishable and destined to unbounded triumph. To this idea of liberty Napoleon was not then unfaithful, although some writers assert that he was ready to draw his sword in any case which promised him promotion. The National Convention, which he saved by military genius and supreme devotion to it, had immortalized itself by inspiring France with heroism, and after a struggle of 3 years with united Christendom, jealous of liberty, dissolved itself, and transferred the government to a Directory. This Directory, in reward of the services which Napoleon had rendered, and in admiration of his genius, bestowed upon him the command of the army of Italy. Probably Josephine, whom he then married, had sufficient influence with Barras to secure the appointment. It was not popular with the generals, of course, to have a young man of 26 without military prestige put over their heads, but the results soon justified the discernment of Barras. At the head of only 40,000 men, poorly clad and equipped, and imperfectly fed, Napoleon in 4 weeks defeated the Sardinians, and in less than 2 years, in 18 pitched battles, he destroyed the Austrian armies which were about to invade France. That glorious campaign of 1796 is memorable for the conquest of Piedmont and Lombardy, and the establishment of French supremacy in Italy. Napoleon's career on the banks of the Po was so brilliant, unexpected, and startling, that his nation was filled with equal astonishment and admiration. Instead of predicted ruin, there was unexampled victory. The enthusiasm of the French was unbounded. Had Napoleon died at the bridge of Lodi, he would have passed down in history as a Judas Maccabeus. In this campaign he won the hearts of his soldiers, and secured the admiration of his generals. There was something new in his system of fighting, not seen at least in modern times, a rapid massing of his troops, and a still more rapid concentration of them upon the weak points of the enemy's lines, coming down on them like a mountain torrent, and sweeping everything before him, in defiance of all rules and precedents. A new master in the art of war, greater than Condé or Turenne or Marlborough or Frederick II., had suddenly arisen, with amazing audacity and faith in himself. The deliverance of republican France from 4 great Austrian armies was a grand service, and Napoleon merited its gratitude and all the honors he received. He had violated no trust thus far. He was still Citizen Bonaparte, professing liberal principles and fighting under the flag of liberty, to make the Republic respected, independent, and powerful. He robbed Italy, it is true, of some of her valuable pictures, and exacted heavy contributions, but this is war. He was still the faithful servant of France. On his return to Paris as a conqueror, the people of course were enthusiastic in their praises, and the government was jealous. It had lost the confidence of the nation. All eyes were turned upon the fortunate soldier who had shown so much ability, and who had given glory to the country. He may not yet have meditated usurpation, but he certainly had dreams of power. He was bent on rising to a greater height, but he could do nothing at present, nor did he feel safe in Paris amid so much envy, although he lived simply and shunned popular idolatry. But his restless nature craved activity, so he sought and obtained an army for the invasion of Egypt. He was inspired with a passion of conquest, and the Directory was glad to get rid of so formidable a rival. He had plainly rendered to his country 2 great services, without tarnishing his own fame or being false to his cause. But what excuse had he to give to the bar of enlightened posterity for the invasion of Egypt? The idea originated with himself. It was not a national necessity. It was simply an unwarrantable war. It was a crime. It was a dream of conquest, without anything more to justify it than Alexander's conquests in India, or any other conquest by ambitious and restless warriors. He hoped to play the part of Alexander, to found a new empire in the East. It was his daring scheme. It would give him power, and perhaps sovereignty. Some patriotic notions may have blended with his visions. Perhaps he would make a new route to India, perhaps cut off the empire of the English in the East, perhaps plant colonies among worn-out races, perhaps destroy the horrid empire of the Turks, perhaps make Constantinople the seat of French influence and empire in the East. But what harm had Turkey or Syria or Egypt done to France? Did they menace the peace of Europe? Did even suffering Egyptians call upon him to free them from a Turkish yoke? No. It was a meditated conquest, on the same principles of ambition and aggrandizement which ever have animated unlawful conquests, and therefore a political crime. Not to be excused because other nations have committed such crimes, ultimately overruled to the benefit of civilization, like the conquest of India by England and Texas by the United States. I will not dwell on this expedition, which failed through the watchfulness of the English, the naval victory of Nelson at the Nile, and the defence of Acre by Sir Sidney Smith. It was the dream of Napoleon at that time to found an empire in the East, of which he would be supreme; but he missed his destiny, and was obliged to return, foiled, baffled, and chagrined, to Paris, his first great disappointment. But he had lost no prestige, since he performed prodigies of valor, and covered up his disasters by lying bulletins. Here he first appeared as the arch liar, which he was to the close of his career. In this expedition he rendered no services to his country or to civilization, except in the employment of scientific men to decipher the history of Egypt, which showed that he had an enlightened mind. During his absence, disasters had overtaken France. Italy was torn from her grasp, her armies had been defeated, and Russia, Austria, and England were leagued for her overthrow. Insurrection was in the provinces, and dissensions raged in Paris. The Directory had utterly lost public confidence, and had shown no capacity to govern. All eyes were turned to the conqueror of Italy, and, as it was supposed, of Egypt also. Section 7 of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 9, European Statesmen, by John Lord. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Napoleon Bonaparte, Part 2. A coup d'état followed. Napoleon's soldiers drove the legislative body from the hall, and he assumed the supreme control, under the name of First Consul. Thus ended the Republic in November, 1799, after a brief existence of 7 years. The usurpation of a soldier began, who trod the Constitution and liberty under his iron feet. He did what Caesar and Cromwell had done, on the plea of a revolutionary necessity. He put back the march of liberty for nearly half a century. His sole excuse was that his undeniable usurpation was ratified by the votes of the French people, intoxicated by his victories, and seeing no way to escape from the perils which surrounded them than under his supreme guidance. They parted with their liberties for safety. Had Napoleon been compelled to wade through slaughter to his throne, as Caesar did, as Augustus did, there would have been no excuse for his usurpation, except the plea of Caesar that liberty was impossible, and the people needed the strong arm of despotism to sustain law and order. But Napoleon was more adroit. He appealed to the people themselves, recognizing them as the source of power, and they confirmed his usurpation by an overwhelming majority. Since he was thus the people's choice, I will not dwell on the usurpation. He cheated them, however, for he invoked the principles of the Revolution, and they believed him, as they afterwards did his nephew. They wanted a better executive government, and were willing to try him, since he had proved his abilities; but they did not anticipate the utter suppression of constitutional government. They still had faith in the principles of their Revolution. They abhorred absolutism; they abhor it still. To destroy it, they had risked the Revolution. To the principles of the Revolution the great body of French people have been true, when permitted to be, from the time when they hurled Louis XVI. From the throne. Absolutism, with the consent of the French nation, has passed away forever, and never can be revived, any more than the oracles of Dodona or the bulls of mediaeval popes. Now let us consider whether, as the executive of the French nation, he was true to the principles of the Revolution which he invoked, and which that people have ever sought to establish. In some respects, it must be confessed, he was, and in other respects he was not. He never sought to revive feudalism; all its abominations perished. He did not bring back the law of entail, nor unequal privileges, nor the regime of nobles. He ruled by the laws, rewarding merit, and encouraging what was obviously for the interests of the nation. The lives and property of the people were protected. The idea of liberty was never ignored. If liberty was suppressed to augment his power and cement his rule, it was in the name of public necessity, as an expression of the interests he professed to guard. When he incited his soldiers to battle, it was always under pretense of delivering enslaved nations and spreading the principles of the Revolution, whose product he was. And until he assumed the imperial title, most of his acts were enlightened, and for the benefit of the people he ruled. There was no obvious oppression on the part of the government, except to provide means to sustain the army, without which France must succumb to enemies. While he was First Consul, it would seem that the hostility of Europe was more directed towards France herself for having expelled the Bourbons, than against him as a dangerous man. Europe could not forgive France for her revolution, not even England. Napoleon was but the necessity which the political complications arising from the Revolution seemed to create. Hence the wars which Napoleon conducted while he was First Consul were virtually defensive, since all Europe aimed to put down France, such a nest of assassins and communists and theorists, rather than to put down Napoleon. For, although usurper, he was, strange to say, the nation's choice as well as idol. He reigned by the will of the nation, and could not have reigned without. The nation gave him his power, to be wielded to protect France, in imminent danger from foreign powers. And wisely and grandly did he use it at first. He turned his attention to the internal state of a distracted country, and developed its resources and promoted tranquillity. He appointed the ablest men, without distinction of party, for his ministers and prefects. He restored the credit of the country. He put a stop to forced loans. He released priests from confinement. He rebuked the fanaticism of the ultra revolutionists. He reorganized the public bodies. He created tribunals of appeal. He ceased to confiscate the property of emigrants, and opened a way for their return. He restored the right of disposing property by will. He instituted the Bank of France on sound financial principles. He checked all disorders. He brought to a close the desolating War of La Vendée. He retained what was of permanent value in the legislation of the Revolution. He made the distribution of the public burdens easy. He paid his army, and rewarded eminent men, whom he enlisted in his service. So stable was the government, and so wise were the laws, and so free were all the channels of industry, that prosperity returned to the distracted country. The middle classes were particularly benefited, the shopkeepers and mechanics; and they acquiesced in a strong rule, since it seemed beneficent. The capital was enriched and adorned and improved. A treaty with the Pope was made, by which the clergy were restored to their parishes. A new code of laws was made by great jurists, on the principles of the Justinian Code. A magnificent road was constructed over the Alps. Colonial possessions were recovered. Navies were built, fortifications repaired, canals dug, and the beet root and tobacco cultivated. But these internal improvements, by which France recovered prosperity, paled before the services which Napoleon rendered as a defender of his country's nationality. He had proposed a peace policy to England in an autograph letter to the king, which was treated as an insult, and answered by the British government by a declaration of war, to last till the Bourbons were restored, perhaps what Napoleon wanted and expected, and war was renewed with Austria and England. The Consulate was now marked by the brilliant Italian campaign, the passage over the Alps, the battle of Marengo, gained by only 30,000 men, the recovery of Italy, and renewed military éclat. The Peace of Amiens, October, 1801, placed Napoleon in the proudest position which any modern sovereign ever enjoyed. He was now 33 years of age, supreme in France and powerful throughout Europe. The French were proud of a man who was glorious both in peace and war, and his consulate had been sullied by only one crime, the assassination of the heir of the house of Condé, a blunder, as Talleyrand said, rather than a crime, since it arrayed against him all the friends of legitimacy in Europe. Had Napoleon been contented with the power he then enjoyed as First Consul for life, and simply stood on the defensive, he could have made France invincible, and would have left a name comparatively reproachless. But we now see unmistakable evidence of boundless personal ambition and a policy of unscrupulous aggrandizement. He assumes the imperial title, greedy for the trappings as well as the reality of power. He openly founds a new dynasty of kings. He abolishes every trace of constitutional rule. He treads liberty under his feet, and mocks the very ideas by which he had inspired enthusiasm in his troops. His watchword is now not liberty, but glory. He centers in himself the interests of France. He surrounds himself at the Tuileries with the pomp and ceremonies of the ancient kings, and he even induces the Pope himself to crown him at Notre Dame. It was a proud day, December 2nd, 1804, when, surrounded by all that was brilliant and imposing in France, Napoleon proceeded in solemn procession to the ancient cathedral, where were assembled the magistrates, the bishops, and the titled dignitaries of the realm, and received, in his imperial robes, from the hands of the Pope, the consecrated sceptre and crown of empire, and heard from the lips of the supreme pontiff of Christendom those words which once greeted Charlemagne in the Basilica of St. Peter when the Roman clergy proclaimed him Emperor of the West: "Vivat in aeternum semper Augustus." The venerable aisles and pillars and arches of the ancient cathedral resounded to the music of 500 performers in a solemn Te Deum. The 60 prelates of France saluted the anointed soldier as their monarch, while the inspiring cry from the vast audience of "Vive l'Empereur" announced Napoleon's entrance into the circle of European sovereigns. But this fresh usurpation, although confirmed by a vote of the French people, was the signal for renewed hostilities. A coalition of all governments unfriendly to France was formed. Military preparations assumed a magnitude never seen before in the history of Europe, which now speedily became one vast camp. Napoleon quit his capital to assume the conduct of armies. He had threatened England with invasion, which he knew was impossible, for England then had nearly 1,000 ships of war, manned by 120,000 men. But when Napoleon heard of the victories of Nelson, he suddenly and rapidly marched to the Rhine, and precipitated 180,000 troops upon Austria, who was obliged to open her capital. Then, reinforced by Russia, Austria met the invader at Austerlitz with equal forces, but only to suffer crushing defeat. Pitt died of a broken heart when he heard of this decisive French victory, followed shortly after by the disastrous overthrow of the Prussians at Jena, and that again by the victory of Eylau over the Russians, which secured the Peace of Tilsit (1807), making Napoleon supreme on the continent of Europe at the age of 39. It was deemed idle to resist further this "man of destiny," who in 12 years, from the condition of an unemployed officer of artillery, without friends or family or influence, had subdued in turn all the monarchies of Europe, with the exception of England and Russia, and regulated at his pleasure the affairs of distant courts. To what an eminence he had climbed! Nothing in history or romance approaches the facts of his amazing career. And even down to this time, to the Peace of Tilsit, there are no grave charges against him which history will not extenuate, aside from the egotism of his character. He claims that he fought for French nationality, in danger from the united hostilities of Europe. Certainly his own glory was thus far identified with the glory of his country. He had rescued France by a series of victories more brilliant than had been achieved for centuries. He had won a fame second to that of no conqueror in the world's history. But these astonishing successes seem to have turned his head. He is dazzled by his own greatness, and intoxicated by the plaudits of his idolaters. He proudly and coldly says that it is a proof of the weakness of the human understanding for anyone to dream of resisting him. He now aims at a universal military monarchy. He seeks to make the kings of the earth his vassals. He places the members of his family, whether worthy or unworthy, on ancient thrones. He would establish on the banks of the Seine that central authority which once emanated from Rome. He apes the imperial Caesars in the arrogance of his tone and the insolence of his demands. He looks upon Europe as belonging to himself. He becomes a tyrant of the race. He centers in the gratification of his passions the interests of humanity. He becomes the angry nemesis of Europe, indifferent to the sufferings of mankind and the peace of the world. After the Peace of Tilsit his whole character seems to have changed, even in little things. No longer is he affable and courteous, but silent, reserved, and sullen. His temper becomes bad. His brow is usually clouded. His manners are brusque. His egotism is transcendent. "Your first duty," said he to his brother Louis when he made him King of Holland, "is to me; your second to France." He becomes intolerably haughty, even to the greatest personages. He insults the ladies of the court, and pinches their ears, so that they feel relieved when he has passed them by. He no longer flatters, but expects incense from everybody. In his bursts of anger he breaks china and throws his coat into the fire. He turns himself into a master of ceremonies. He cheats at cards. He persecutes literary men. Napoleon's career of crime is now consummated. He divorces Josephine, the greatest mistake of his life. He invades Spain and Russia, against the expostulations of his wisest counsellors, showing that he has lost his head, that reason has toppled on her throne; for he fancies himself more powerful than the forces of nature. All these crimes are utterly inexcusable except on the plea of madness. Such gigantic crimes, such a recklessness of life, such uncontrollable ambition, such a defiance of justice, such an abrogation of treaties, such a disregard of the interests of humanity, to say nothing of the welfare of France, prostituted, enslaved, downtrodden, and all to nurse his diabolical egotism, astonished and shocked the whole civilized world. These things more than balanced all the services he ever rendered, since they directly led to the exhaustion of his country. They were so atrocious that they cried aloud to heaven for vengeance. And heaven heard the agonizing shrieks of misery which ascended from the smoking ruins of Moscow, from the bloody battlefield of Borodino, from the river Berezina, and from the homes of the murdered soldiers, from the widows and orphans of more than 1 million of brave men who had died to advance his glory, from the dismal abodes of 25 millions more whom he had cheated out of their liberties and mocked with his ironical proclamations, yea, from the millions in Prussia, Austria, and England who had been taxed to the utmost to defeat him, and had died martyrs to the cause of nationalities, or what we call the balance of power, which European statesmen have ever found it necessary to maintain at any cost, since on this balance hang the interests of feeble and defenceless nations. Ay, Heaven heard the God whom he ignored, and sent a retribution as signal and as prompt and as awful as his victories had been overwhelming. I need not describe Napoleon's fall. As clear a destiny as his rise, a lesson to all the future tyrants and conquerors of the world, a moral to be pondered as long as history shall be written. Hear, ye heavens, and give ear, O earth, to the voice of eternal justice, as it appealed to universal consciousness, and pronounced the doom of the greatest sinner of modern times, to be defeated by the aroused and indignant nations, to lose his military prestige, to incur unexampled and bitter humiliation, to be repudiated by the country he had raised to such a pitch of greatness, to be dethroned, to be imprisoned at Elba, to be confined on the rock of St. Helena, to be at last forced to meditate, and to die with vultures at his heart, a chained Prometheus, rebellious and defiant to the last, with a world exultant at his fall, a hopeless and impressive fall, since it broke for 50 years the charm of military glory, and showed that imperialism cannot be endured among nations craving for liberties and rights which are the birthright of our humanity. Did Napoleon, then, live in vain? No great man lives in vain. He is ever, whether good or bad, the instrument of divine providence. Gustavus Adolphus was the instrument of God in giving religious liberty to Germany. William the Silent was his instrument in achieving the independence of Holland. Washington was his instrument in giving dignity and freedom to this American nation, this home of the oppressed, this glorious theater for the expansion of unknown energies and the adoption of unknown experiments. Napoleon was his instrument in freeing France from external enemies, and for vindicating the substantial benefits of an honest but uncontrolled revolution. He was his instrument in arousing Italy from the sleep of centuries, and taking the first step to secure a united nation and a constitutional government. He was his instrument in overthrowing despotism among the petty kings of Germany, and thus showing the necessity of a national unity, at length realized by the genius of Bismarck. Even in his crimes Napoleon stands out on the sublime pages of history as the instrument of Providence, since his crimes were overruled in the hatred of despotism among his own subjects, and a still greater hatred of despotism as exercised by those kings who finally subdued him, and who vainly attempted to turn back the progress of liberal sentiments by their representatives at the Congress of Vienna. The fall of Napoleon taught some awful and impressive lessons to humanity, which would have been unlearned had he continued to be successful to the end. It taught the utter vanity of military glory; that peace with neighbors is the greatest of national blessings, and war the greatest of evils; that no successes on the battlefield can compensate for the miseries of an unjust and unnecessary war; and that avenging justice will sooner or later overtake the wickedness of a heartless egotism. It taught the folly of worshipping mere outward strength, disconnected from goodness; and finally it taught that God will protect defenseless nations, even guilty nations, when they shall have expiated their crimes and follies, and prove himself the kind father of all his children, even amid chastisements, gradually leading them, against their will, to that blessed condition when swords shall be beaten into plowshares, and nations shall learn war no more. What remains to day of those grand Napoleonic ideas which intoxicated France for 20 years, and which, revived by Louis Napoleon, led to a brief glory and an infamous fall, and the humiliation and impoverishment of the most powerful state of Europe? They are synonymous with imperialism, personal government, the absolute reign of a single man, without constitutional checks, a return to Caesarism, to the unenlightened and selfish despotism of pagan Rome; and hence they are now repudiated by France herself, as well as by England and America, as false, as selfish, as fatal to all true national progress, as opposed to every sentiment which gives dignity to struggling states, as irreconcilably hostile to the civilization which binds nations together, and which slowly would establish liberty and peace and industry and equal privileges, and law and education and material prosperity upon this fallen world. Authorities. So much has been written on Napoleon that I can only select some of the standard and accessible work. Bourrienne's Memoirs of Napoleon I. L. P. Junot's Memoirs of Napoleon, Court and Family. Las Casas Napoleon at St. Helena. Thiers' History of the Consulate and the Empire. Memoirs of Prince Metternich. Segur's History of Expedition to Russia. Memoirs of Madame de Remusat. Vissot's Napoleon, His Sayings and Deeds. Napoleon's confidential correspondence with Josephine and with his brother Joseph. Alison's History of Europe. Lockhart's and Sir Walter Scott's Lives of Napoleon. Court and Camp of Napoleon, in Murray's Family Library. W. Forsyth's Captivity at St. Helena. Dr. Channing's Essay on Napoleon. Lord Brougham's Sketch of Napoleon. J. G. Wilson's Sketch of Napoleon. Life of Napoleon by A. H. Yamini. Headley's Napoleon and His Marshals. Napier's Peninsular War. Wellington's Despatches. Guilford's Life of Pitt. Botta's History of Italy under Napoleon. Labaume's Russian Campaign. Berthier's Histoire de l'expédition d'Égypte. End of section 7. Section 8 of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 9, European Statesmen, by John Lord. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Prince Metternich, Part 1. 1773 to 1859, Conservatism. In the later years of Napoleon's rule, when he had reached the summit of power, and the various German states lay prostrate at his feet, there arose in Austria a great man, on whom the eyes of Europe were speedily fixed, and who gradually became the central figure of continental politics. This remarkable man was Count Metternich, who, more than any other man, set in motion the secret springs which resulted in a general confederation to shake off the degrading fetters imposed by the French conqueror. In this matter he had a powerful ally in Baron von Stein, who reorganized Prussia, and prepared her for successful resistance, when the time came, against the common enemy. In another lecture I shall attempt to show the part taken by von Stein in the regeneration of Germany, but it is my present purpose to confine attention to the Austrian chancellor and diplomatist, his various labors and the services he rendered, not to the cause of freedom and progress, but to that of absolutism, of which he was in his day the most noted champion. Metternich, in his character as diplomatist, is to be contemplated in two aspects. First, as aiming to enlist the great powers in armed combination against Napoleon, and secondly, as attempting to unite them and all the German states to suppress revolutionary ideas and popular insurrections, and even constitutional government itself. Before presenting him in this double light, however, I will briefly sketch the events of his life until he stood out as the leading figure in European politics, as great a figure as Bismarck later became. Clemens Wenzel Nepomuk Lothar, Count von Metternich, was born at Koblenz on the Rhine, May 15, 1773. His father was a nobleman of an ancient family. I will not go into his pedigree, reaching far back in the Middle Ages, a matter so important in the eyes of German and even English biographers, but to us in America of no more account than the genealogy of the Dukes of Edom. The Count, his father, was probably of more ability than an ordinary nobleman in a country where nobles are so numerous, since he was then, or soon after, Austrian ambassador to the Netherlands. Young Metternich was first sent to the University of Strasbourg at the age of 15, about the time when Napoleon was completing his studies at a military academy. In 1790, a youth of 17, he took part in the ceremonies attending the coronation of Emperor Leopold at Frankfurt, and made the acquaintance of the Archduke, who 2 years later succeeded to the imperial dignity as Francis II. We next see him a student of law in the University of Mainz, spending his vacations at Brussels in his father's house. Even at that time Metternich attracted attention for his elegant manners and lively wit, a born courtier, a favorite in high society, and so prominent for his intelligence and accomplishments that he was sent to London as an attaché to the Netherlands embassy, where it seems that he became acquainted with the leading statesmen of England. There must have been something remarkable about him to draw, at the age of 20, the attention of such men as Burke, Pitt, Fox, and Sheridan. What interested him most in England were the sittings of the English Parliament and the trial of Warren Hastings. At the early age of 21 he was appointed minister to the Hague, but was prevented going to his post by the war, and retired to Vienna, which he now saw for the first time. Soon after he married a daughter of Prince Kaunitz, eldest son of the great chancellor who under 3 reigns had controlled the foreign policy of the empire. He thus entered the circle of the highest nobility of Austria, the proudest and most exclusive on the face of the whole earth. At first the young count, living with his bride at the house of her father, and occupying the highest social position, with wealth and ease and every luxury at command, fond equally of books, of music, and of art, but still fonder of the distinguished society of Vienna, and above all enamored of the charms of his beautiful and brilliant wife, wished to spend his life in elegant leisure. But his remarkable talents and accomplishments were already too well known for the emperor to allow him to remain in his splendid retirement, especially when the empire was beset with dangers of the most critical kind. His services were required by the state, and he was sent as ambassador to Dresden after the peace of Luneville, 1801, when his diplomatic career in reality began. Dresden, where were congregated at this time some of the ablest diplomatists of Europe, was not only an important post of observation for watching the movements of Napoleon, but it was itself a capital of great attractions, both for its work of art and for its society. Here Count Metternich resided for 2 years, learning much of politics, of art, and letters, the most accomplished gentleman among all the distinguished people that he met, not as yet a man of power, but a man of influence, sending home to Count Stadion, Minister of Foreign Affairs, reports and letters of great ability, displaying a sagacity and tact marvelous for a man of 28. Napoleon was then engaged in making great preparations for a war with Austria, and it was important for Austria to secure the alliance of Prussia, her great rival, with whom she had never been on truly friendly terms, since both aimed at ascendency in Germany. Friedrich William III. was then on the throne of Prussia, having 2 great men among his ministers, von Stein and Hardenberg, the former at the head of financial affairs, the latter at the head of the foreign bureau. To the more important post of Berlin Metternich was therefore sent. He found great difficulty in managing the Prussian king, whose jealousy of Austria balanced his hatred of Napoleon, and who therefore stood aloof and inactive, indisposed for war, in strict alliance with Russia, who also wanted peace. The Czar Alexander I., who had just succeeded his murdered father Paul, was a great admirer of Napoleon. His empire was too remote to fear French encroachments or French ideas. Indeed, he started with many liberal sentiments. By nature he was kind and affectionate; he was simple in his tastes, truthful in his character, philanthropic in his views, enthusiastic in his friendships, and refined in his intercourse, a broad and generous sovereign. And yet there was something wanting in Alexander which prevented him from being great. He was vacillating in his policy, and his judgment was easily warped by fanciful ideas. His life was worn out between devotion to certain systems and disappointment as to the results. He was fitful, uncertain, and practical. Hence he made continual mistakes. He meant well, but did evil, and the discovery of his errors broke his heart. He died of weariness of life, deceived in all his calculations, in 1825. Metternich spent 4 years in Berlin ferreting out the schemes of Napoleon and striving to make alliances against him. But he found his only sincere and efficient ally to be England, then governed by Pitt. The King of Prussia was timid and leaned on Russia. He feared to offend his powerful neighbor on the north and east. Nor was Prussia then prepared for war. As for the South German states, they all had their various interests to defend, and had not yet grasped the idea of German unity. There was not a great statesman or a great general among them all. They had their petty dynastic prejudices and jealousies, and were absorbed in the routine of court etiquette and pleasures, stagnant and unenlightened. The only brilliant court life was at Weimar, where Goethe reigned in the circle of his idolaters. The great men of Germany at that time were in the universities, interested in politics like the Humboldts at Berlin, but not taking a prominent part. Generals and diplomatists absorbed the active political field. As for orators, there were none, for there were no popular assemblies, no scope for their abilities. The able men were in the service of their sovereigns as diplomatists in the various courts of Europe, and generally were nobles. Diplomacy, in fact, was the only field in which great talents were developed and rewarded outside the realm of literature. In this field Metternich soon became preeminently distinguished. He was at once the prompting genius and the agent of an absolute sovereign who ruled over the most powerful state, next to France, on the continent of Europe, and the most august. The Emperor of Austria was supposed to be the heir of the Caesars and of Charlemagne. His territories were more extensive than that of France, and his subjects were more numerous than those of all the other German states combined, except Prussia. But the Emperor himself was a feeble man, sickly in body, weak in mind, and governed by his ministers, the chief of whom was Count Stadion, minister of foreign affairs. In Austria the aristocracy was more powerful and wealthy than the nobility of any other European state. It was also the most exclusive. No one could rise by any talents into their favored circle. They were great feudal landlords, and their ranks were not recruited, as in England, by men of genius and wealth. Hence they were narrow, bigoted, and arrogant; but they had polished and gracious manners, and shone in the stiff though elegant society of Vienna, not brilliant as in Paris or London, but exceedingly attractive, and devoted to pleasure, to grand hunting parties on princely estates, to operas and balls and theatres. Probably Vienna society was dull if it was elegant, from the etiquette and ceremonies which marked German courts; for what was called society was not that of distinguished men in letters and art, but almost exclusively that of nobles. A learned professor or wealthy merchant could no more get access to it than he could climb to the moon. But as Vienna was a Catholic city, great ecclesiastical dignitaries, not always of noble birth, were on an equality with counts and barons. It was only in the Church that a man of plebeian origin could rise. Indeed, there was no field for genius at all. The musician Haydn was almost the only genius that Austria at that time possessed outside of diplomatic or military ranks. Napoleon had now been crowned emperor, and his course had been from conquering to conquer. The great battles of Austerlitz and Jena had been fought, which placed Austria and Prussia at the mercy of the conqueror. It was necessary that some one should be sent to Paris capable of fathoming the schemes of the French emperor, and in 1806 Count Metternich was transferred from Berlin to the French capital. No abler diplomatist could be found in Europe. He was now 33 years of age, a nobleman of the highest rank, his father being a prince of the empire. He had a large private fortune, besides his salary as ambassador. His manners were perfect, and his accomplishments were great. He could speak French as well as his native tongue. His head was clear, his knowledge was accurate and varied. Calm, cold, astute, adroit, with infinite tact, he was now brought face to face with Talleyrand, Napoleon's minister of foreign affairs, his equal in astuteness and dissimulation, as well as in the charms of conversation and the graces of polished life. With this statesman Metternich had the pleasantest relations, both social and diplomatic. Yet there was a marked difference between them. Talleyrand had accepted the ideas of the Revolution, but had no sympathy with its passions and excesses. He was the friend of law and order, and in his heart favored constitutional government. On this ground he supported Napoleon as the defender of civilization, but afterward deserted him when he perceived that the emperor was resolved to rule without constitutional checks. His nature was selfish, and he made no scruple of enriching himself, whatever master he served. But he was not indifferent to the welfare and glory of France. Metternich, on the other hand, abhorred the ideas of the Revolution as much as he did its passions. He saw in absolutism the only hope of stability, the only reign of law. He distrusted constitutional government as liable to changes, and as unduly affected by popular ideas and passions. He served faithfully and devotedly his emperor as a sacred personage, ruling by divine right, to whom were entrusted the interests of the nation. He was comparatively unselfish, and was prepared for any personal sacrifices for his country and his sovereign. Metternich was treated with distinguished consideration at Paris, not only because he was the representative of the oldest and proudest sovereignty in Europe, still powerful in the midst of disasters, but also on account of his acknowledged abilities, independent attitude, and stainless private character. All the other ambassadors at Paris were directed to act in accordance with his advice. In 1807 he concluded the Treaty of Fontainebleau, which was most favorable to Austrian interests. He was the only man at court whom Napoleon could not browbeat or intimidate in his affected bursts of anger. Personally, Napoleon liked him as an accomplished and agreeable gentleman. As a diplomatist and statesman, the emperor was afraid of him, knowing that the Austrian was at the bottom of all the intrigues and cabals against him. Yet he dared not give Metternich his passports, nor did he wish to quarrel with so powerful a man, who might defeat his schemes to marry the daughter of the Austrian emperor, the light-headed and frivolous Marie Louise. So Metternich remained in honor at Paris for 3 years, studying the character and aims of Napoleon, watching his military preparations, and preparing his own imperial master for contingencies which would probably arise; for Napoleon was then meditating the conquest of Spain, as well as the invasion of Russia, and Metternich as well as Talleyrand knew that this would be a great political blunder, diverting his armies from the preservation of the conquests he had already made, and giving to the German states the hope of shaking off their fetters at the first misfortune which should overtake him. No man in Europe so completely fathomed the designs of Napoleon as Metternich, or so profoundly measured and accurately estimated his character. And here I cannot forbear to quote his own language, both to show his sagacity and to reproduce the portrait he drew of Napoleon. "He became," says Metternich, "a great legislator and administrator, as he became a great soldier, by following out his instincts. The turn of his mind always led him toward the positive. He disliked vague ideas, and hated equally the dreams of visionaries and the abstractions of idealists. He treated as nonsense everything that was not clearly and practically presented to him. He valued only those sciences which can be verified by the senses, or which rest on experience and observation. He had the greatest contempt for the false philosophy and false philanthropy of the 18th century. Among its teachers, Voltaire was the special object of his aversion. As a Catholic, he recognized in religion alone the right to govern human societies. Personally indifferent to religious practices, he respected them too much to permit the slightest ridicule of those who followed them; and yet religion with him was the result of an enlightened policy, rather than an affair of sentiment. He was persuaded that no man called to public life could be guided by any other motive than that of interest. He was gifted with a particular tact in recognizing those men who could be useful to him. He had a profound knowledge of the national character of the French. In history he guessed more than he knew. As he always made use of the same quotations, he must have drawn from a few books, especially abridgments. His heroes were Alexander, Caesar, and Charlemagne. He laid great stress on aristocratic birth and the antiquity of his own family. He had no other regard for men than a foreman in a manufactory feels for his work people. In private, without being amiable, he was good natured. His sisters got from him all they wanted. Simple and easy in private life, he showed himself to little advantage in the great world. Nothing could be more awkward than he in a drawing room. He would have made great sacrifices to have added 3 inches to his height. He walked on tiptoe. His costumes were studied to form a contrast with the circle which surrounded him, by extreme simplicity or extreme elegance. Talma taught him attitudes. Having but one passion, that of power, he never lost either his time or his means in those objects which deviated from his aims. Master of himself, he soon became master of events. In whatever period he had appeared, he would have played a prominent part. His prodigious successes blinded him, but up to 1812 he never lost sight of the profound calculations by which he so often conquered. He never recoiled from fear of the wounds he might cause. As a war chariot crushes everything it meets on its way, he thought of nothing but to advance. He could sympathize with family troubles; he was indifferent to political calamities. Disinterested generosity he had none; he only dispensed his favors in proportion to the value he put on the utility of those who received them. He was never influenced by affection or hatred in his public acts. He crushed his enemies without thinking of anything but the necessity of getting rid of them. In his political combinations he did not fail to reckon largely on the weakness or errors of his adversaries. The alliance of 1813 crushed him because he was not able to persuade himself that the members of the coalition could remain united, and persevere in a given course of action. The vast edifice he constructed was exclusively the work of his own hands, and he was the keystone of the arch; but the gigantic construction was essentially wanting in its foundations, the materials of which were nothing but the ruins of other buildings. Such is the verdict of one of the acutest and most dispassionate men that ever lived. Napoleon is not painted as a monster, but as a supremely selfish man bent entirely on his own exaltation, making the welfare of France subservient to his own glory, and the interest of humanity itself secondary to his pride and fame. History can add but little to this graphic sketch, although indignant and passionate enemies may dilate on the Corsican's hard-heartedness, his duplicity, his treachery, his falsehood, his arrogance, and his diabolic egotism. On the other hand, weak and sentimental idolaters will dwell on his generosity, his courage, his superhuman intellect, and the love and devotion with which he inspired his soldiers, all which in a sense is true. The philosophical historian will enumerate the services Napoleon rendered to his country, whatever were his virtues or faults; but of these services the last person to perceive the value was Metternich himself, even as he would be the last to acknowledge the greatness of those revolutionary ideas of which Napoleon was simply the product. It was the French Revolution which produced Napoleon, and it was the French Revolution which Metternich abhorred, in all its aspects, beyond any other event in the whole history of the world. But he was not a rhetorician, as Burke was, and hence confined himself to acts, and not to words. He was one of those cool men who could use decent and temperate language about the devil himself and the pandemonium in which he reigns. On the breaking up of diplomatic relations between Austria and France in 1809, Metternich was recalled to Vienna to take the helm of state in the impending crisis. Count von Stadion, though an able man, was not great enough for the occasion. Only such a consummate statesman as Metternich was capable of taking the reins entrusted to him with unbounded confidence by his feeble master, whose general policy and views were similar to those of his trusted minister, but who had not the energy to carry them out. Metternich was now made a prince, with large gifts of land and money, and occupied a superb position, similar to that which Bismarck occupied later on in Prussia, as chancellor of the empire. It was Metternich's policy to avert actual hostilities until Austria could recover from the crushing defeat at Austerlitz, and until Napoleon should make some great mistake. He succeeded in arranging another treaty with France within the year. The object which Napoleon had in view at this time was his marriage with Marie Louise, from which he expected an heir to his vast dominions, and a more completely recognized position among the great monarchs of Europe. He accordingly divorced Josephine, some historians say with her consent. 10 years earlier his offers would, of course, have been indignantly rejected, or 3 years later, after the disasters of the Russian campaign. But Napoleon was now at the summit of his power, the arbiter of Europe, the greatest sovereign since Julius Caesar, with a halo of unprecedented glory, a prodigy of genius as well as recognized monarch. Nothing was apparently beyond his aspirations, and he won the daughter of the successor of Charlemagne in marriage; and her father, the proud Austrian emperor, was willing to give her up to his conqueror from reasons of state, and from policy and expediency. To all appearance it was no sacrifice to Marie Louise to be transferred from the dull court of Vienna to the splendid apartments of the Tuileries, to be worshipped by the brilliant marshals and generals who had conquered Europe, and to be crowned as Empress of the French by the Pope himself. Had she been a nobler woman, she might have hesitated and refused. But she was vain and frivolous, and was overwhelmed by the glory with which she was soon to be surrounded. And yet the marriage was a delicate affair, and difficult to be managed. It required all the tact of an arch diplomatist. So Prince Metternich was sent to Paris to bring it about. In fact, it was he more than any one else who for political reasons favored this marriage. Napoleon was exceedingly gracious, while Metternich had his eyes and ears open. He even dared to tell the emperor many unpleasant truths. The affair, however, was concluded, and after Napoleon's divorce from Josephine in 1810, the Austrian princess became Empress of the French. End of section 8. Section 9 of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 9, European Statesmen, by John Lord. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Prince Metternich, Part 2. One thing was impressed on the mind of Metternich during the festivities of this second visit to Paris, and that was that during the year 1811 the peace of Europe would not be disturbed. Napoleon was absorbed with the preparations for the invasion of Russia, the only power he had not subdued except England, and a power in secret coalition with both Prussia and Austria. His acquisitions would not be secured unless the Colossus of the North was hopelessly crippled. Metternich saw that the campaign could not begin until 1812, and that the Emperor had need of all the assistance he could get from conquered allies. He saw also the mistakes of Napoleon, and meant to profit by them. He anticipated for that daring soldier nothing but disaster in attempting to battle the powers of nature at such a distance from his capital. He perceived that Napoleon was alienating, in his vast schemes of aggrandizement, even his own ministers, like Talleyrand and Fouché, who would leave him the moment they dared, although his marshals and generals might remain true to him because of the enormous rewards which he had lavished upon them for their military services. He knew the discontent of Italy and Poland because of unfulfilled promises. He knew the intense hatred of Prussia because of the humiliations and injuries Napoleon had inflicted on her. Metternich was equally aware of the hostility of England, although Pitt had passed away, and he despised the arrogance of a man who looked upon himself as greater than destiny. "It is an evidence of the weakness of the human understanding," said the infatuated conqueror, "for any one to dream of resisting me." So Metternich, after the marriage ceremony and its attendant festivities, foreseeing the fall of a conqueror, retired to his post at Vienna to complete his negotiations, and make his preparations for the renewal of the conflict, which he now saw was inevitable. His work was to persuade Prussia, Russia, and the lesser powers, of the absolute necessity of a sincere and cordial alliance to make preparations for the conflict to put down, or at least successfully to resist, the common enemy, the ruthless and unscrupulous disturber of the peace of Europe; not to make war, but to prepare for war in view of contingencies; and this not merely to preserve the peace of Europe, but to save themselves from ruin. All his confidential letters to his sovereign indicate his conviction that the throne of Austria was in extreme danger of being subverted. All his despatches to ambassadors show that affairs were extremely critical. His policy, in general terms, was pacific. He longed for peace on a settled basis. But his policy in the great crisis of 1811 and 1812 was warlike, not for immediate hostilities, but for war as soon as it would be safe to declare it. It was his profound conviction that a lasting peace was utterly impossible so long as Napoleon reigned, and this was the conviction also of Pitt and Castlereagh of England, and of the Prussian Hardenberg. The main trouble was with Prussia. Frederick William III was timid, and considering the intense humiliation of his subjects and the overpowering ascendency of Napoleon, saw no hope but in submission. He was afraid to make a move, even when urged by his ministers. Indeed, he had in 1808 exiled the greatest of them, Stein, at the imperious demand of the French emperor, sending him to a Rhenish city, whence he was soon after compelled to lead a fugitive life as an outlaw. It is true the king did not like Stein, and saw him go without regret. He could not endure the overshadowing influence of that great man, and was offended by his brusque manners and his plain speech. But Stein saw things as Metternich saw them, and had, when the prime minister, devoted himself to administrative and political reforms. Prince Hardenberg, the successor of Stein, was easily convinced of Metternich's wisdom, for he was a patriot and an honest man, though loose in his private morals in some respects. Metternich had an ally, too, in Schornhurst, who was remodeling the whole military system of Prussia. The king, however, persisted in his timid policy until the Russian campaign, a course which, singularly enough, proved the wisest in his circumstances. When at last the king yielded, all Prussia arose with unbounded enthusiasm to engage in the war of liberation. Prussia needed no urging when actually invaded. Austria openly threw off her conservative appearance of armed neutrality, and the coalition for which Metternich had long been laboring, and of which he was the life and brain, became a reality. The battle of Leipsic settled the fate of Napoleon. Even before that fatal battle was fought, however, Napoleon, had he been wise, might have saved himself. If he had been content in 1812 to spend the winter in Smolensk, instead of hurrying on to Moscow, the enterprise might not have been disastrous. But after his retreat from Russia, with the loss of the finest army that Europe ever saw, he was doomed. Yet he could not brook further humiliation. He resolved still to struggle. "It may cost me my throne," said he, "but I will bury the world beneath its ruins." He marched into Germany in the spring of 1813 with a fresh army of 350,000 men, replacing the 500,000 he had squandered in Russia. Metternich shrank from further bloodshed, but clearly saw the issue. "You may have peace," he said in an audience with Napoleon. "Peace or war lie in your own hands, but you must reduce your power, or you will fail in the contest." "Never," replied Napoleon. "I shall know how to die, but I will not yield a handbreadth of soil." "You are lost, then," said the Austrian chancellor, and withdrew. "It is all over with the man," said Metternich to Berthier, Napoleon's chief of staff. and he turned to marshal the forces of his empire. A short time was given Napoleon to reconsider, but without effect. At 12 o'clock, August 10th, 1813, negotiations ceased. The beacon fires were lighted, and hostilities recommenced. During the preparations for the Russian campaign, Austria had been neutral and the rest of Germany submissive. But now Russia, Prussia, and Austria were allied, by solemn compact, to fight to the bitter end, not to ruin France, but to dethrone Napoleon. The allied monarchs then met at Toplitz with their ministers, to arrange the plan of the campaign, the Austrian armies being commanded by Prince Schwarzenberg and the Prussians by Blücher. Then followed the battle of Leipsic on the 16th to the 18th of October, 1813, the battle of the nations, it has been called, and Napoleon's power was broken. Again the monarchs, with their ministers, met at Basel to consult, and were there joined by Lord Castlereagh, who represented England, the allied forces still pursuing the remnants of the French army into France. From Basel the conference was removed to the heights of the Vosges, which overlooked the plains of France. On the 1st of April, 1814, the allied sovereigns took up their residence in the Parisian palaces, and on April 4th Napoleon abdicated and was sent to Elba. He still had 12,000 or 15,000 troops at Fontainebleau, but his marshals would have shot him had he made further resistance. On the 4th of May, Louis XVIII. Was seated on the throne of his ancestors, and Europe was supposed to be delivered. Considering the evils and miseries which Napoleon had inflicted on the conquered nations, the allies were magnanimous in their terms. No war indemnity was even asked, and Napoleon in Elba was allowed an income of 6,000,000 francs, to be paid by France. After the leaders of the allies had settled affairs at Paris, they reassembled at Vienna, ostensibly to reconstruct the political system of Europe and secure a lasting peace; in reality, to divide among the conquerors the spoils taken from the vanquished. The Congress of Vienna, in session from November, 1814, to June, 1815, of which Prince Metternich was chosen president by common consent, was one of the grandest gatherings of princes and statesmen seen since the Diet of Worms. There were present at its deliberations the Czar of Russia, the Emperor of Austria, the kings of Prussia, Denmark, Bavaria, and Würtemberg, and nearly every statesman of commanding eminence in Europe. Lord Castlereagh represented England, Talleyrand represented the Bourbons of France, and Hardenberg Prussia. Von Stein was also present, but without official place. Besides these was a crowd of petty princes, each with attachés. Metternich entertained the visitors in the most lavish and magnificent manner. The government, though embarrassed and straitened by the expense of the late wars, allowed £10,000 a day, equal perhaps in that country and at that time to £50,000 to day in London. Nothing was seen but the most brilliant festivities, incessant balls, fêtes, and banquets. The greatest actors, the greatest singers, and the greatest dancers were allured to the giddy capital, never so gay before or since. Beethoven was also there, at the height of his fame, and the great assembly rooms were placed at his disposal. The sittings of the Congress, in view of the complicated questions which had to be settled, did not regularly begin until November. The meetings at first were harmonious, but ere long they became acrimonious, as the views of the representatives of the four great powers, Russia, Austria, England, and Prussia, were brought to light. They all, except England, claimed enormous territories as a compensation for the sacrifices they had made. Talleyrand at first was excluded from the conferences, but his wonderful skill as a diplomatist soon made his power felt. He was the soul of intrigue and insincerity. All the diplomatists were at first wary and prudent, then greedy and unscrupulous. Violent disputes arose. The Emperor Alexander openly quarreled with Metternich, and refused to be present at his parties, although they had been on the most friendly terms. In the division of the spoils, the Czar claimed the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, to be nominally under the rule of a sovereign, but really to be incorporated with his vast empire. Metternich resisted this claim with all the ability he had, as bringing Russia too dangerously near the frontiers of Austria. But Alexander had laid Prussia under such immense obligations that Frederick William supported his claims, with the mutual understanding, however, that Prussia should annex the kingdom of Saxony, since Saxony had supported Napoleon. The plenipotentiaries were in such awe of the vast armies of the Czar that they were obliged to yield to this wicked annexation; and Poland, once the most powerful of the mediaeval kingdoms of Europe, was wiped out of the map of independent nations. This acquisition by far outbalanced all the expenses which Alexander had incurred during the War of Liberation. It made Russia the most powerful military empire in the world. Although Prussia and Austria had been, since the times of Frederick the Great, in perpetual rivalry, the greatness of the common danger from such a warlike neighbor now induced Metternich to make every overture to Prussia to prevent a possible calamity to Germany. But Frederick William was obstinate, and his league with Alexander could not be broken. It appears, from the memoirs of Metternich, that it had been for a long time his desire to unite Prussia and Austria in a firm alliance, in order to protect Germany in case of future wars. That was undoubtedly his true policy. It was the policy 50 years later of Bismarck, although he was obliged to fight and humble Austria before he could consummate it. With Russia on one side and France on the other, the only hope of Germany is in union. But this aim of the great Austrian statesman was defeated by the stupidity and greed of the Prussian king, and by his interested friendship with the autocrat of all the Russias. Alexander got Poland, with an addition of about 4,000,000 subjects to his empire. A greater resistance was made to the outrageous claims of Prussia. She wanted to annex the whole of Saxony and important provinces on the Rhine, which would have made her more powerful than Austria. Neither Metternich nor Talleyrand nor Castlereagh would hear of this crime, and so angry and threatening were the disputes in the Congress that a treaty was signed by England, France, and Austria for an offensive and defensive alliance against Prussia and Russia, in case the claims of Prussia were persisted in. After the combination of Russia, Prussia, Austria, and England against Napoleon, there was imminent danger of war breaking out between these great powers in the matter of a division of spoils. In rapacity and greed they showed themselves as bad as Napoleon himself. Prussia, however, was the most greedy and insatiable of all the contracting parties. She always has been so since she was erected into a kingdom. The cruel terms exacted by Bismarck and Moltke in their late conquest with France indicate the real animus of Prussia. The conquerors would have exacted 10 milliards instead of 5 as a war indemnity, if they thought that France could pay it. They did not dare to carry away the pictures of the Louvre, nor perhaps did those iron warriors care much for them, but they did want money and territory, and were determined to get all they could. Prussia was a poor country, and must be enriched anyway by the unexpected spoils which the fortune of the war threw into her hands. This same rapacity was seen at the Congress of Vienna, but the opposition to it was too great to risk another war, and Prussia, at the entreaty of Alexander, abated some of her demands, as did also Russia her own. The result was that only half of Saxony was ceded to Prussia, raising the subjects of Prussia to 10 millions. The tact and firmness of Talleyrand and Castlereagh had prevented the utter absorption of Saxony in the new military monarchy. Talleyrand, whose designs could never be fathomed by the most astute of diplomatists, had succeeded also in isolating Russia and Prussia from the rest of Europe, and raising France into a great power, although her territories were now confined to the limits which had existed in 1792. He had succeeded in detaching Austria and the southern states of Germany from Prussia. He had split Germany into two rival powers, just what Louis Napoleon afterwards aspired to do, hoping to derive from their mutual jealousies some great advantage to France in case of war. Neither of them, however, realized the intense common love of both Austria and Prussia, and indeed of all the German states at heart, for fatherland needing only the genius of a very great man finally to unite them together into one great nation, impossible to be hereafter vanquished by any single power. Austria retained for her share Lombardy, Venice, Parma, Placentia, the finest part of Italy, that which was known in the time of Julius Caesar as Cisalpine Gaul. She did not care for the Low Countries, which formed a part of the old empire of Charles V, since to keep that territory would cost more than it would pay. She also received from Bavaria the Tyrol. As for the results of the Congress of Vienna, the Netherlands and Holland were united into one kingdom, under a prince of the House of Nassau. Naples returned to the rule of the Bourbons. Genoa became a part of Piedmont. The petty independent states of Germany, some 300, were united into a confederation of 37, called the German Confederacy, to afford mutual support in time of war, and to be directed by a Diet, in which Austria and Prussia were to have 2 votes each, while Bavaria, Württemberg, and Hanover were to have 1 vote each. Thus Prussia and Austria had 4 votes out of 7, which practically gave to these two powers, if they chose to unite, the control of all external relations. As to internal affairs, the legislative power was vested in representatives from all the States, both small and great. It will be seen that the higher interests of Germany were not considered in this Congress at all, attention being directed solely to a division of spoils. But while the Congress was dividing between the princes who composed its acquisition of territory by conquest, and quarreling about their respective shares like the members of a family that had come into a large fortune, news arrived of the escape of Napoleon from Elba, after a brief 10 months' detention, the adherence to him of the French army, and the consequent dethronement of Louis XVIII. The Congress at once dispersed, forgetting all its differences, while the great monarchs united once more in pouring such an avalanche of troops into France and Belgium that Napoleon stood no chance of retaining his throne, whatever military genius he might display. After his defeat at Waterloo, the allies occupied Paris, and this time exacted a large war indemnity of £40,000,000, and left an army of occupation of 150,000 men in France until the money should be paid. They also returned to their owners the pictures of the Louvre which Napoleon had taken in his various conquests. It was while the allies were in Paris settling the terms of the second peace that what is called the Holy Alliance was formed between Alexander, Frederick William, and Francis, to whom were afterward added the kings of France, Naples, and Spain, which had for its object the suppression of liberal ideas throughout the continent in the name of religion. Some of these monarchs were religious men in their way, especially the Czar, who had been much interested in the spread of Christianity, and the King of Prussia; but even these men thought more of putting down revolutionary ideas than they did of the triumphs of religion. We must, however, turn our attention to Metternich as the administrator of a large empire rather than as a diplomatist, although for 30 years after this his hand was felt, if not seen, in all the political affairs of Europe. He was now 44 years of age, in the prime of his strength and the fulness of his fame, a prince of the empire, chancellor and prime minister to the Emperor Francis. On his shoulders were imposed the burdens of the state. He ruled with delegated powers indeed, but absolutely. The master whom he served was weak, but was completely in accord with Metternich on all political questions. He of course submitted all important documents to the emperor and requested instructions, but all this was a matter of form. He was allowed to do as he pleased. He was always exceedingly deferential, and never made himself disagreeable to his sovereign, who could not do without him. From first to last they were on the most friendly terms with each other, and there was no jealousy of his power on the part of the emperor. The chancellor was a gentleman and had extraordinary tact. But his labors were prodigious, and gave him no time for pleasure, or even social intercourse, which finally became irksome to him. He was too busy with public affairs to be a great scholar, and was not called upon to make speeches, as there was no deliberative assembly to address. Nor was he a national idol. He lived, retired in his office, among ministers and secretaries, and appeared in public as little as possible. End of Section 9. Section 10 of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 9, European Statesmen, by John Lord. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Prince Metternich, Part 3. After the final dethronement of Napoleon, the policy of Metternich with reference to foreign powers was pacific. He had seen enough of war, and it had no charm for him. War had brought Germany to the verge of political ruin. All his efforts as chancellor were directed to the preservation of peace and the balance of power among all nations. At the close of the great European struggle, the finances of all the German states were alike disordered, and their industries paralyzed. Compared with France and England, Germany was poor, and wages for all kinds of labor were small. It became Metternich's aim to develop the material resources of the empire, which could be best done in time of peace. Austria accordingly took part in no international contest for 50 years, except to preserve her own territories. Metternich did not seem to be ambitious of further territorial aggrandizement for his country. It required all his talents to preserve what she had. Indeed, the preservation of the status quo everywhere was his desire, without change and without progress. He was a conservative, like the English Lord Eldon, who supported established institutions because they were established, and any movement or any ideas which interrupted the order of things were hateful to him, especially agitations for greater political liberty. A constitutional government was his abhorrence. Hence the policy of Metternich's home rule was fatal to all expansion, to all emancipating movements, to all progress, to everything which looked like popular liberty. Men might smoke, drink beer, attend concerts and theatres, amuse themselves in any way they pleased; but they should not congregate together to discuss political questions; they should not form clubs or societies with political intent of any kind; they should not even read agitating tracts and books. He could not help their thinking, but they should not criticize his government. They should be taught in schools directed by Roman Catholic priests, who were good classical scholars, good mathematicians, but who knew but little and cared less about the theories of political economy, or even history unless modified to suit religious bigots of the mediaeval type. He maintained that men should be contented with the sphere in which they were born; that discontent was no better than rebellion against Providence; that any change would be for the worse. He had no liking for universities, in which were fomented liberal ideas; and those professors who sought to disturb the order of things, or teach new ideas, anything to make young scholars think upon anything but ordinary duties, were silenced, or discharged, or banished. The word rights was an abomination to him. Men, he thought, had no rights, only duties. He disliked the press more than he did the universities. It was his impression that it was antagonistic to all existing governments. Hence he fettered the press with restrictions, and confined it to details of little importance. He would allow no comments which unsettled the minds of readers. In no country was the censorship of the press more inexorable than in Austria and its dependent States. All that spies and a secret police and priests could do to ferret out associations which had in view a greater liberty, was done; all that soldiers could do to suppress popular insurrection was effected, and all in the name of religion, since he looked upon free inquiry as logically leading to scepticism, and scepticism to infidelity, and infidelity to revolution. In the Catholic sense Metternich was a religious man, since he recognized in the Roman Catholic Church the conservation of all that is valuable in society, in government, and even in civilization. He brought Catholics to his aid in cementing political despotism, for absolutism and Catholicism, as Sir James Stephen so well said, are but convertible terms. Accordingly he brought back the Jesuits, and restored them to their ancient power and wealth. He formed the strictest union with the Pope. He rewarded ecclesiastics, and honored the great dignitaries of the established Church as his most efficient and trusted lieutenants in the war he waged on human liberty. But I must allude to some of the things which gave this great man trouble. Of course nothing worried him so much as popular insurrections, since they endangered the throne, and opposed the cherished ends of his life. As early as 1817 what he called sects disturbed Central Europe. These were a class of people who resembled the Methodists of England, and the followers of Madame von Krudener in Russia, generally mystics in religion, who practiced the greatest self denial in this world to make sure of the promises of the next. The kingdom of Würtemberg, the Grand Duchy of Baden, and Suabia were filled with these people, perfectly harmless politically, yet with views which Metternich considered an innovation, to be stifled in the beginning. So of Bible societies. He was opposed to these as furnishing a class of subjects for discussion which brought up to his mind the old dissertations on the rights of man. "The Catholic Church," he writes to Count Nesselrode, the Russian minister, "does not encourage the universal reading of the Bible, which should be confined to persons who are calm and enlightened." But he goes on to say that he himself at 45 reads daily 1 or 2 chapters, and finds new beauties in them, while at the age of 20 he was a skeptic, and found it difficult not to think that the family of Lot was unworthy to be saved, Noah unworthy to have lived, Saul a great criminal, and David a terrible man; that he had tried to understand everything, but that now he accepts everything without cavil or criticism. Truly a Catholic might say, "See the glorious peace and repose which our faith brings to the most intellectual of men." In 1819 an event occurred, of no great importance in itself, but which was made the excuse for increased stringency in the suppression of liberal sentiments throughout Germany. This was the assassination of von Kotzebue, the dramatic author, at Mannheim, at the hands of a fanatic by the name of Sand. Kotzebue had some employment under the Russian government, and was supposed to be a propagandist of the views of the Czar, who had lately become exceedingly hostile to all emancipating movements. In the early part of his reign Alexander was called a Jacobin by Metternich, who despised his philanthropical and sentimental theories, and his energetic labors in behalf of literature, educational institutions, freer political conditions, etc. But when Napoleon was sent to St. Helena, the Russian ruler, wearied with great events and dreading revolutionary tendencies, changed his opinions, and was now leagued with the King of Prussia and the Emperor of Austria in supporting the most stringent measures against all reformers. Sand was a theological student in the University of Jena, who thought he was doing God's service by removing from the earth with his assassin's dagger a vile wretch employed by the Russian tyrant to propagate views which mocked the loftiest aspirations of mankind. The murder of Kotzebue created an immense sensation throughout Europe, and was followed by increased rigor on the part of all despotic governments in muzzling the press, in the suppression of public meetings of every sort, and especially in expelling from the universities both students and professors who were known or even supposed to entertain liberal ideas. Metternich even went so far as to write a letter to the King of Prussia urging him to disband the gymnasia, as hotbeds of mischief. His influence on this monarch was still further seen in dissuading him to withhold the constitution promised his subjects during the War of Liberation. He regarded the meeting of a general representation of the nation as scarcely less evil than democratic violence, and his hatred of constitutional checks on a king was as great as of intellectual independence in a professor at a gymnasium. Universities and constituent assemblies, to him, were equally fatal to undisturbed peace and stability in government. In the midst of these efforts to suppress throughout Germany all agitating political ideas and movements, the news arrived of the revolution in Naples, July, 1820, effected by the Carbonari, by which the king was compelled to restore the constitution of 1813 or abdicate. Metternich lost no time in assembling the monarchs of Austria, Prussia, and Russia, with their principal ministers, to a conference or congress at Troppau, with a view of putting down the insurrection by armed intervention. The result is well known. The armies of Austria and Russia, 170,000 men, restored the Neapolitan tyrant to his throne, while he, on his part, revoked the constitution he had sworn to defend, and affairs at Naples became worse than they were before. In no country in the world was there a more execrable despotism than that exercised by the Bourbon Ferdinand. The prisons were filled with political prisoners, and these prisons were filthy, without ventilation, so noisome and pestilential that even physicians dared not enter them; while the wretched prisoners, mostly men of culture, chained to the most abandoned and desperate murderers and thieves, dragged out their weary lives without trial and without hope. And this was what the king, supported and endorsed by Metternich, considered good government to be. The following year saw an insurrection at Piedmont, when the patriotic party hoped to throw all northern Italy upon the rear of the Austrians, but which resulted, as will be treated elsewhere, in a sad collapse. The victory of absolutism in Italy was complete, and all people seeking their liberties became the object of attack from the three great powers, who obeyed the suggestions of the Austrian Chancellor, now unquestionably the most prominent figure in European politics. He had not only suppressed liberty in the country which he directly governed, but he had united Austria, Prussia, and Russia in a war against the liberties of Europe, and this under the guise of religion itself. Metternich now thought he had earned a vacation, and in the fall of 1821 he made a visit to Hanover. He had previously visited Italy with the usual experience of cultivated Germans, unbounded admiration for its works of art and sunny skies and historical monuments. He was as enthusiastic as Madame de Staël over St. Peter's and the Pantheon. In his private letters to his wife and children, so simple, so frank, so childlike in his enjoyment, no one would suppose he was the arch and cruel enemy of all progress, with monarchs for his lieutenants and governors for his slaves. His journey to Hanover was a triumphant procession. The King George IV. Embraced him with that tenderness which is usual with monarchs when they meet one another, and in the fulsomeness of his praise compared him to all the great men of antiquity and of modern times, Caesar, Cato, Gustavus Adolphus, Marlborough, Pitt, Wellington, and the whole catalogue of heroes. On his return journey to Vienna, Metternich stopped to rest himself a while at Johannisberg, the magnificent estate on the Rhine which the Emperor had given him, near where he was born, and where he had stored away 40 huge casks of his own vintage, worth 600 ducats a cask, for the use of monarchs and great nobles alone. From thence he proceeded to Frankfort, a beautiful but to him a horrible town, I suppose, because it was partially free; and while there he took occasion to visit 5 universities, at all of which he was received as a sort of deity, the students following his carriage with uncovered heads, and with cheers and shouts, curious to see what sort of a man it was who had so easily suppressed revolution in Italy, and who ruled Germany with such an iron hand. And yet, while Metternich so completely extinguished the fires of liberty in the countries which he governed, he was doomed to see how hopeless it was to do the same in other lands by mere diplomatic intrigues. In 1822 the Spanish Revolution broke out, and a year after came the Greek Revolution with all its complications, ending in a war between Russia and Turkey. From this he stood aloof, since if he helped the Turks to put down insurrection he would offend the Emperor Alexander, thus far his best ally, and commit Austria to a war from which he shrank. It was his policy to preserve his country from entangling wars. It was as much as he could do to preserve order and law in the various states of Germany, at the cost of all intellectual progress. But he watched the developments of liberty in other parts of Europe with the keenest interest, and his correspondence with different potentates, whether monarchs or their ministers, is very voluminous, and was directed to the support of absolutism, in which alone he saw hope for Europe. The liberal views of the English Canning gave Metternich both solicitude and disgust, and he did all he could to undermine the influence of Capo d'Illustrius, the Greek diplomatist, with his imperial master the Czar. He hated any man who was politically enlightened, and destroyed him if he could. The event in his long reign which most perplexed him and gave him the greatest solicitude was the revolution in France in 1830, which unseated the Bourbons and established the constitutional government of Louis Philippe. And this was followed by the insurrection of the Netherlands, revolts in the German states, and the Polish Revolution. Within the year 1830 began a new era in European politics, a period of reform, not always successful, but enough to show that the spirit of innovation could no longer be suppressed, that the subterranean fires of liberty would burst forth when least expected, and overthrow the strongest thrones. But amid all the reforms which took place in England, in France, in Belgium, in Piedmont, Austria remained stationary. So cemented was the power of Metternich, so overwhelming was his influence, the one central figure in Germany for 18 years longer. In 1835 the Emperor Francis died, recommending to his son and successor Ferdinand to lean on the powerful arm of the Chancellor, and continue him in great offices. Nor was it until the outbreak in Vienna in 1848, when emperor and minister alike fled from the capital, that the official career of Metternich closed, and he finally retired to his estates at Johannesburg to spend his few declining years in leisure and peace. For 40 years Metternich had borne the chief burdens of the state. For 40 years his word was the law of Germany. For 40 years all the cabinets of continental Europe were guided, more or less, by his advice; and his advice, from first to last, was uniform: to put down popular movements, and uphold absolutism at any cost, and severely punish all people, of whatever rank or character, who tempted the oppressed to shake off their fetters, or who dared to give expression to emancipating ideas, even in the halls of universities. In view of the execrable tyranny, both political and religious, which Metternich succeeded in establishing for 30 years, it is natural for an ordinary person to look upon him as a monster, hard, cruel, unscrupulous, haughty, gloomy, a sort of Wallenstein or Strafford, to be held in abhorrence, a man to be assassinated as the enemy of mankind. But Metternich was nothing of the sort. As a man, in all his private relations he was amiable, gentle, and kind to everybody, and greatly revered by domestic servants and public functionaries. By his imperial master he was treated as a brother or friend, rather than as a minister; while on his part he never presumed on any liberties, and seemed simply to obey the orders of his sovereign, orders which he himself suggested with infinite tact and politeness, unlike Stein and Bismarck, who were overbearing and rude even in the presence of the sovereign and court. Metternich had better manners and more self control. Indeed, he was the model of a gentleman wherever he went. He was the hardest worked man in the empire, and he worked from the stimulus of what he conceived to be his duty, and for the welfare of the country, as he understood it. He was the hardest worked man in the empire, and he worked from the stimulus of what he conceived to be his duty, and for the welfare of the country, as he understood it. Though one of the richest men in Austria, and of the highest social rank, he lived in frugal simplicity, despising pomp and extravagance alike. His highest enjoyment, outside the society of his family, was music. The whole realm of art was his delight, but he loved nature even more than art. He enjoyed greatly the repose of his own library, an apartment 18 feet high, and containing 15,000 volumes. The only unamiable thing about Metternich was his fear of being bored. He maintained that it was impossible to find over 6 interesting men in any company whatever. With people whom he trusted he was unusually frank and free spoken. With diplomatists he wore a mask, and made it a point to conceal his thoughts. He deceived even Napoleon. No one could penetrate his intentions. Under a smooth and placid countenance, unruffled and calm on all occasions, he practiced when he pleased the profoundest dissimulation, and he dissimulated by telling the truth oftener than by concealing it. He knew what the ars celare artem meant. When he could find leisure he was fond of travelling, especially in Italy, but he hated and avoided the discomforts of travel. If he made distant journeys he travelled luxuriously, and wherever he went he was received with the greatest honors. At Rome the Pope treated him as a sovereign. The Tsar Alexander commanded his magnates to give him the same deference that they gave to himself. While the world regarded Metternich as the most fortunate of men, he yet had many sorrows and afflictions, which saddened his life. He lost 2 wives and 3 of his children, to all of whom he was devotedly attached, yet bore the loss with Christian resignation. He found relief in work and in his duties. There were no scandals in his private life. He professed and seemed to feel the greatest reverence for religion in the form which had been taught him. He detested vulgarity in every shape, as he did ordinary vices, from which he was free. He was self conscious and loved attention and honors, but was not a slave to them, like most German officials. Nothing could be more tender and affectionate than his letters to his mother, to his wife, and to his daughters. His father he treated with supreme reverence. No public man ever gave more dignity to domestic pleasures. "The truest friends of my life," said he, "are my family and my master," and to each he was equally devoted. On the death of his second wife, in 1829, he writes: "I feel this misfortune most deeply. I have lost everything for the remainder of my days. The other world is daily more and more peopled with beings to whom I am united by the closest ties of affection. I too shall take my place there, and I shall disengage myself from this life with all the less regret. My only relief is in work. I am at my desk by 9 in the morning. I leave it at 5, and return to it at half past 6, and work till half past 10, when I receive visitors till midnight." Time, however, brought its relief, and in 1831 he married the Princess Melanie, and his third marriage was as happy as the others appear to have been. In the diary of this wife, December 31st, I read: "We supped at midnight, and exchanged good wishes for the new year. May God long preserve to me my good, kind Clement, and illuminate him with his divine light. It touches me to see the pleasure it gives him to talk with me on business, and read to me what he writes." Such was the great Austrian statesman in his private life, a dutiful son, a loving and devoted husband, an affectionate father, a faithful servant to his emperor, a kind master to his dependents, a courteous companion, a sincere believer in the doctrines of his church, a man conscientious in the discharge of duties, and having at heart the welfare of his country as he understood it, amid innumerable perils from foreign and domestic foes. As a statesman he was vigilant, sagacious, experienced, and devoted to the interests of his imperial master. But what were Metternich's services, by which great men claimed to be judged? He could say that he was the promoter of law and order; that he kept the nation from entangling alliances with foreign powers; that he was the friend of peace, and detested war except upon necessity; that he developed industrial resources, and wisely regulated finances; that he secured national prosperity for 40 years after desolating wars; that he never disturbed the ordinary vocations of the people, or inflicted unnecessary punishments; and that he secured to Austria a proud preeminence among the nations of Europe. But this was all. Metternich did nothing for the higher interests of Germany. He kept it stagnant for 40 years. He neither advanced education, nor philanthropy, nor political economy. He was the unrelenting foe of all political reforms and of all liberal ideas. What we call civilization, beyond amusements and pleasures and the ordinary routine of business, owes to him nothing, not even codes of law or enlightened principles of government. Judged by his services to humanity, Metternich was not a great man. His highest claims to greatness were in a vigorous administration of public affairs and diplomatic ability in his treatment of foreign powers, but not in far reaching views or aims. As a ruler he ranks no higher than Mazarin or Walpole or Castlereagh, and far below Canning, Peel, Pitt, or Thiers. Indeed, Metternich takes his place with the tyrants of mankind, yet showing how benignant, how courteous, how interesting, and even religious and beloved a tyrant can be, which is more than can be said of Richelieu or Bismarck, the only two statesmen with whom he can be compared, all three ruling with absolute power delegated by irresponsible and imperial masters, like Mordecai behind the throne of Xerxes, or Maecenas at the court of Augustus. Authorities. The greatest authority is the Autobiography of Metternich. But Alison's history, though dull and heavy, and marked by Tory prejudices, is reliable. Fyffe may be read with profit in his Recent History of Modern Europe; also Müller's Political History of Recent Times. The Annual Register is often quoted by Alison. Schlosser's History of Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries is a good authority. Section 11.